Okay, something's bothering me that I have to get off my chest. And I've been seeing something on YouTube a little bit. I saw, a couple videos from various Linux creators, and it's something that just has kind of nagged at me. And I recently got an email, and I went back and forth with someone from the channel, and they basically were saying, hey, Microsoft is going to probably transition to the Linux kernel in the next couple years. And then I saw like Lunduke make this video about, hey, that Microsoft could switch to the Linux kernel and what would that future look like? All these are just wrong. It's never going to happen. I've been in business for a long time. I understand how most of this stuff works. I've dealt with Microsoft and licensing, and I've been on Windows for literally 20 years. And I think a lot of this comes from someone that has lost a little bit of perspective when it comes to Windows and Linux. And it's something that's I have to address in this video. So I'm going to come out and address this. So let's get into it. Why would Microsoft never switch to the Linux kernel? Because guess what? They're never going to switch to the Linux kernel. Now, before everyone runs to the comments and goes, well, WSL's out, Windows subsystem for Linux. I was there for version 1. I'm already messing around with it with version 2. And a lot of my friends are full stack developers. And guess what? They are forced to use it sometimes. So I get to hear about WSL all the time. And that is a tack on to Windows. It is not a test bed to see, hey, can Windows run? No, it's none of that. The only purpose of WSL is to get Windows users staying on Windows and giving those users the ability to just never touch Linux desktop. So not only is it not good for Linux desktop, but it actively discourages adoption of Linux. So let's go ahead and cut that right out of the way. WSL, not good for Linux desktop. However, it's not to say I don't hate the actual feature. I really actually enjoy this in Windows when I'm using Windows. I do like to use WSL. So let's just go ahead and clear the air with that myth. So why would Microsoft not use the Linux kernel? That's what you're asking. I know it. But the answer is very, very simple, and it's this. They have a huge ecosystem that's pretty much closed off. Yes, there's Wine. Yes, there's all these emulators and app streaming and all these other features. But for the most part, most Windows applications only work on Windows natively. And this is a very important, this is what's called a vendor lock-in. It's basically just saying, hey, Adobe has made specifically their suite over the past 20 years, and it's based all off Windows, which is amazing for Microsoft. And the reason why they can't switch the kernel is because, well, all these companies, Adobe and thousands upon thousands, probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of companies that rely on their Windows-only programs to run would have to switch and redesign them because most people don't design for multiple operating systems. And that is a huge problem, but one that is very good for Microsoft. If Microsoft were to change the kernel, guess what? No one would be forced to use Microsoft Windows. There's a ton of options. A lot of the issues people have with Linux desktop would just free up and they could use the applications that they want. That's what Microsoft is trying to avoid at all costs. Now, some people go, well, the actual kernel developers, they have to pay and upkeep and all this other stuff, and that's a problem for Microsoft. And I'm here to tell you, no, it's not. A big problem would be if they switched their kernel and it literally alienated, shut down entire businesses because they couldn't remake it on a different platform or a different operating system. And that caused that business to go under, or they had to donate and actually spend thousands upon thousands and millions of dollars redeveloping their software for Linux. Because guess what? That Linux kernel and the Microsoft kernel are two very, very different things. As I've said, fundamentally, Linux and Windows are very different. So I want to go ahead and just say this. I'm just getting kind of worked up because I'm just sick of answering this question. And it's one that keeps getting thrown up in my face by some Linux users. And it's just like, hey, you've lost perspective. You don't understand how Microsoft Windows works. Microsoft Windows is the dominant factor why 80% of the population uses it, not because it's a good operating system. We know that. I've made tens, if not 20 or 30 videos about how crappy Microsoft Windows is fundamentally and how unsecure it is. And I could just go on and on and on, but watch those videos if you're interested in that. Linux is a far more secure and reliable operating system. That's why almost every server out there, most data centers are like 70% Linux now. That's because they don't crash. They're a heck of a lot more secure and they're reliable. You don't need to reboot them every time you do anything on them. So, I just had to get off that off my chest. I'm just so tired of this falsehood, and we need to drop it. Let's be realistic here, and I'm going to bring everybody back to ground, and I might even be flamed on this video with a whole bunch of thumbs downs. I don't care. This is never going to happen. Microsoft Windows will always use their own kernel. It's just what they will do, because if they don't, they're going to lose a lot of business, and they're going to lose tons and tons of money, way more than it costs the development team over there to maintain the Microsoft Windows kernel, which, let's just be honest here, the kernel really hasn't changed that much in the past 20 years. Microsoft has just basically not changed much at all fundamentally at its core. I mean, hell, look at Windows 7 compared to Windows 10. It's just skinned different. I mean, there's a little bit of changes here and there. Yes, they did add UAC with Windows XP, Service Pack 2, but fundamentally, the kernel's pretty much the same since like what, the late 90s? Just so sick of hearing this falsehood and myth, and I had to make this video because I don't want to hear another person say Microsoft Windows is going to transition to the Linux kernel. No, it's not. That's just ridiculous for a whole variety of reasons. And I'm here to tell you, I love technology and I understand Windows, I understand Linux, and my job is to kind of bridge the gap between everybody so you can use whatever operating system you want to use. I want to give you the choice. You've heard me say that 100 times. But don't think there's going to be like this Frankenstein computer that just molds it all together or one company solve it. Because at the end of the day, big companies don't really innovate. They just buy out smaller companies that do the work for them. That's it. And if you need proof of that, just look up the story of the iPhone. So with all that said, let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. I'm sure I'm going to get roasted a little bit because I was a little passionate about this video, and that's just because of a lot of my Windows Linux views, and they both function completely different. And to think that Windows could just magically switch to the Linux kernel without much blowback or a huge investment, it just never will happen. So let's stop kidding ourselves and just say, hey, Linux is Linux, Windows is Windows, and let's bridge that gap between the two worlds, because one world's not going to change. I can tell you that right now. But as always, thank you to all my patrons. Without you, I couldn't make videos like this one, and I'll see you in the next video.